In the spring of 1931, 4 young women were brutally murdered in San Diego County. Virginia Brooks, Louise Tuber, Dolly Bibbens, and Hazel Bradshaw. These 4 young women and girls had no connection to each other except that they were all violently and horrifically murdered within a 3-month span of terror that cast the city of San Diego under a dark shadow. Despite the presence of ample physical evidence, none of the women's killers were ever brought to justice, and a question remained unanswered. Were the 4 murders committed by separate killers, or by one? On the morning of February 11th, 1931, 10-year-old Virginia Brooks left her house on University Avenue to head off to school at Euclid Elementary. Her normal route to school took her west down University through the modern-day neighborhood of City Heights, but in the 1930s it was still quite a rural area, and the quiet road was lined with trees. Virginia's 12-year-old brother rode past her on his bicycle and waved. That was the last time anyone ever saw her alive. Virginia had a friend waiting for her a few blocks away, but she never arrived at their usual meeting spot. At some point between where her brother rode past her and where her friend was waiting, Virginia disappeared. Panic immediately gripped the neighborhood, and a massive search effort was launched to find the missing girl. Authorities feared the worst as days and weeks passed with no trace of Virginia Brooks. A month later, on March 10th, Virginia's body was finally found. A sheep herder named George Moses was walking his dog in an undeveloped part of Miramar Air Base, then known as Camp Kearney. His dog alerted him to a burlap sack that had been haphazardly tossed into a clump of sagebrush. What George found inside the bag was horrifying. Virginia's murderer had decapitated and dismembered her body. Her remains were so badly decomposed that authorities concluded that she had been killed within a day of her kidnapping. The coroner was unable to determine Virginia's cause of death, but he theorized that she had been subdued with a blow to the head, then strangled to death. The still developing city of San Diego could hardly believe such an atrocity could occur within its sunny borders. It wasn't long before the witch hunt began. Over the next month, dozens of men would be arrested with little to no evidence in connection with Virginia's savage murder. Suspects ranged from teenage boys to elderly men, farmers, vagabonds, residents of San Diego, and those living as far away as Oklahoma were all brought in, questioned, and ruled out one by one until all possible avenues were exhausted. There were a few physical clues at the scene where her body was dumped like disregarded trash. There were tire tracks leading up to and away from the sagebrush, indicating that Virginia's killer had likely disposed of her body by chucking it out the window of his moving vehicle. Police hoped they would be able to match the tire tracks to a particular automobile, but were unsuccessful. Clutched in Virginia's hand were a few hairs, likely those of her killer, which were alternately described as being blonde or gray, depending on the news report. Beyond that, there was very little evidence, and the case has remained unsolved to this day. San Diego had hardly recovered from the shock of Virginia's murder when a second body was found. On April 19, 1931, Tomas Martinez, along with his wife and young children, were looking for a spot to have a picnic near an oak grove at the base of a mountain in northeastern San Diego County. They came upon a gruesome sight: the nude body of a young woman hanging from a tree. Her name was Louise Tuber, and she had been dead for approximately 12 hours. Louise Tuber was 17 years old. She had been living with her father and older sister in this house just north of Balboa Park. Louise and her father did not get along, though her father had tried his best to raise her following the death of her mother several years back. One night, Louise wanted to go out with a friend, but her father forbade her. She snuck out anyway, disappearing into the night. Newspapers called Louise a modern woman who had many gentleman callers, which is basically the 1930s version of slut-shaming. I like to think Louise was just a free spirit, perhaps a little ahead of her time. In any case, her father was furious with her when she returned home in the early hours of the next morning. He scolded her, he told the police, and then he left for work, and that was the last time he ever saw her. Louise decided that weekend that she had had enough, and she told her coworkers that she intended to leave town. She left a note for her father that said,
"Dear Dad, I have tried for a long time to be satisfied with the way you are running the house, and I can stand it no longer. I am leaving home tonight, and I am not coming back."
Tragically, she was correct. Louise never made it home alive. At some point around midnight on the evening of April 18th, she had met her end at the hands of an unknown assailant. It appeared that Louise had been struck by a blow to the head which rendered her unconscious, and she likely remained unconscious as she was strangled to death by the noose. Her clothes had been removed and folded in a neat pile next to her body. Aside from the blow to the head and strangulation, there were no signs of trauma to her body, no evidence that she had been raped, though I don't know how accurate such investigations were in the 1930s. Perhaps if Louise had been killed today, there would have been ample DNA and fingerprint evidence to point to a suspect. But in 1931, police could only guess as to how, why, and who had murdered Louise Tuber. A similar public outcry and witch hunt followed, though with less fervor this time. Police thought it was much more likely that Louise had been killed by someone she knew, rather than a stranger. Just 4 days later, a third victim was found. On April 23, 1931, a woman known as Dolly Bibbens was found dead inside her downtown apartment on 11th Avenue. The scene of the crime showed evidence of a violent struggle. Dolly was lying on the bed. She had been garroted with a blood-stained towel and severely beaten. At first, the police couldn't tell if she had been strangled or had her throat slit. Dolly had been dead for 5 or 6 days, so although hers was the third body found, she was actually the second woman killed. Little was known about Dolly Bibbens. She was in her mid to late 30s and had been married to a man who had committed suicide a year previously. She was not wealthy, but she liked to gamble, and she was known to wear expensive-looking jewelry. Robbery was considered as a motive, but none of her jewels were taken from the apartment, with the exception of a single ring that had been ripped from her finger. Would the same person have had time to kill both Dolly Bibbens and Louise Tuber? I believe it was possible. The killer could have slayed Dolly first, then exited the apartment where he may have encountered the newly runaway Louise. Louise worked downtown, and she was last seen alive exiting a downtown store with a strange man that her friends did not recognize on the night of April 18th. So the killer could have met Louise downtown fresh off his killing of Dolly, and then taken her up to the mountains that night, where he then murdered her. On May 3rd, 1931, the body of the fourth and final victim, Hazel Bradshaw, was found stabbed to death in Balboa Park. She was killed in a section of the park which has since been torn down. At the time it was known as the Painted or Indian Village and had been serving as a Boy Scout camp in 1931. It was 2 Boy Scouts who found her, gruesomely slaughtered at the hands of someone who stabbed her a total of 19 times. Hazel was in her early 20s and had been working as a telephone operator for the San Diego Railroad. She lived in this house in Normal Heights with her parents and 6 siblings. Like Louise, Hazel drew the attention of many male admirers, and on the night of her murder, she had gone on a date with a man named Moss Garrison, her on-again, off-again boyfriend. Unlike the other victims, in Hazel Bradshaw's case, only one suspect was ever really considered, and that was Moss Garrison. He was immediately arrested and quickly tried for the crime. He maintained his innocence and claimed that he had taken Hazel to see a movie on May 2nd. After the film, he walked her home through Balboa Park and up 1.5 miles to Hazel's house, where he dropped her off just before midnight and then went home. The problem with Garrison's story is that evidence indicated that Hazel was killed around 9:45, so she couldn't have made it to her house around midnight. Her mother said she had stayed awake that night worrying when Hazel didn't come home, and that she would have heard her come in if she had. Garrison was also, to put it bluntly, an extremely creepy individual who had shown jealous and possessive tendencies towards Hazel. Both her mother and sister testified that they had heard Garrison threaten Hazel, telling her, "If I can't have you, no one will." However, Garrison maintained his innocence when he took the witness stand to testify in his defense. Despite the evidence against him, the courtroom audience seemed to be on Garrison's side. During the trial, the defense's counter-argument centered on a mysterious sailor who was dating one of Hazel's sisters. Garrison claimed that he had seen a black sedan parked on the street as he walked Hazel home, and another witness corroborated this. Unfortunately for Garrison, though, the prosecution produced a final witness before they rested their case. A woman who claimed that it was she, and not some mysterious sailor, who drove past Balboa Park in a black sedan that night, and that she had heard a woman scream. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before delivering a verdict. Not guilty. Personally, I think Garrison got away with murder. Something about him just sends a chill down my spine. Hazel's mother and sister knew it, but for some reason, public opinion at the time held differently. Police had even found a blood-soaked tie in his apartment when they searched it. I'm curious as to whether that tie still exists somewhere, tucked away in storage wherever they keep cold case files. So, were these 4 victims all murdered by the same serial killer? This is just my opinion, but I think Hazel was most likely killed by Garrison, and that he was not the killer of the other 3 girls. The killing method was different, and in Hazel's case there's a clear motive. I think it could be possible that the first 3 were committed by the same person, but just because it's possible doesn't mean it's likely. I think the uncomfortable truth may be that all 4 of these women were killed by separate people, and that actually makes it creepier. That there may have been 4 depraved killers roaming San Diego in the spring of 1931, and they were never caught.